You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynne Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Monday the 20th of May. Were they or weren't they? Channel 4 dispatches on Shropshire sex ring. Machete murderer who admits killing up to 400 people can't be booted out of the UK. Kent Police 9, Border Agency 5. Marine Le Pen injured spine in fall. Germany calls for 2-year ban on jihadists returning from Syria. Stockholm, riots in usually calm suburb of Husby. Don't you just love Texans? World Value Survey shows world's most racist countries. Saudi cleric prohibit women from using air conditioning. Thought for the day, are we shooting ourselves in the foot yet again? And finally, this really bugs me. UK news. Were they or weren't they? Channel 4 dispatches on Shropshire sex ring. The Shropshire Star tells us the horrific abuse and sexual exploitation of schoolgirls by a group of Asian men in Shropshire and the problems facing police officers in bringing them to justice without being accused of racism is to be exposed in a hard-hitting TV documentary. Channel 4 will be showing The Hunt for Britain's Sex Gangs at 9 p.m. on Thursday the 23rd of May 2013. The hour-long dispatches, special featuring interviews with many of Operation Chalice's leading detectives, will tell the story of one of Britain's largest ever child sex abuse investigations into a sex ring. The investigations were part of Operation Chalice, which uncovered over 100 victims and 200 or so suspects. After several trials over almost 2 years, 7 men have been sentenced for their role in these crimes. The leading players in the network of abusers, almost all of Pakistani origin, were brothers Adel and Mubarak Ali from Regent Street in Wellington. Peter Hennigan, publicity manager for Channel 4, said 3 years ago Telford Police allowed cameras to start filming what was to become one of the biggest child sex abuse cases in the UK. Mr Hennigan said that the programme examined how Telford Police also had to face the reality that the men who were perpetrators in this case were all British Pakistanis. World at 8 asks, were they all Pakistani or not? The Shropshire Star says almost all and Channel 4 says all. Well, it bears out pro-fam in that it is a Muslim family affair and goes back generations. Have you heard that, Avsal? Machete murderer who admits killing up to 400 people can't be booted out of UK. A murderer who admits killing up to 400 people, many in bloody machete attacks, is living in the UK after being granted asylum. John Tuo has been living in a taxpayer-funded home since sneaking in illegally from Africa in 2003 and receives £160 a month pocket money from the National Asylum Support Service. For 7 years he worked for the Mungiki in Kenya, a criminal mob behind some of the continent's worst atrocities. Tuo, 27, admitted an immigration tribunal to killing about 100 to 400 people. He even said he'd taken part in the sickening practice of female genital mutilation. He was granted asylum after claiming he'd be killed if he returned to Kenya. World at 8 states, well, he could be killed over here, couldn't he? What's MI6 doing, for God's sake? We really need a reality check in the UK, don't we? Kent Police 9, Border Agency 5. 9 suspected illegal immigrants covered in flour emerged from their hiding place in a German food tanker on the M26 and casually strolled off into the countryside. Quickly rounded up by Kent police officers and handed over to the border agency, 4 were set free, taken to hostels, provided with free accommodation and even told how to apply for asylum and benefits. Kent police say that for the past 2 years they've received an average 1 report a day relating to clandestine immigration. It's believed that the group had sneaked into the tanker in France before being brought to England without the knowledge of the driver. World at 8 comments, it's reached the second stage of sheer lunacy now. It's open season in the UK for all and sundry who can get here. Close the channel and put guns on the cliffs and have security staff armed at airports. That's what other countries do to keep us out without being called names. It's easier to obtain forgiveness than permission. Idi Amin realised that one. European news. Marine Le Pen injures spine in fall. Marine Le Pen fractured her spine after falling into an empty swimming pool in France. Miss Le Pen had been capitalising recently on growing discontent over economic gloom, record unemployment levels and President Hollande's personal unpopularity. Her father broke the news to explain Marine's absence from a Front National meeting in Limoges. It is a particularly painful condition which severely limits movements and may require surgery to put right. The accident happened as Marine mowed the lawn at her home near Perpignan and slipped into the empty pool. Front National officials said that although the injury would limit her travelling, it would not stop her taking part in meetings, press conferences and interviews. Germany calls for a 2-year ban on jihadists returning from Syria. Fearing the return of European jihadists from Syria, German Interior Minister Hans-Peter Friedrich is calling for the EU to bar their return home. It's believed that up to 700 Europeans joined opposition fighters in Syria and could pose a threat upon returning to the EU. Officials at the ministry said that of the 6,000 foreign militants believed to be fighting the Assad regime, between 400 and 700 are European. A survey by King's College London found last month that up to 600 individuals from countries including the UK, Spain, Sweden and Germany had taken part in the Syrian conflict since the war erupted in 2011. The largest contingent was from the UK. Our World at 8 writer concludes, and of course we will welcome them back with open arms and wonder what happened and why they did it when an atrocity is committed on British soil. After all, these returnees will not be the buffoons of the Birmingham 4 Lions or the Dewsbury 6 Lions. They'll be highly trained and battle-hardened soldiers who have no love for Europeans and especially us British. Stockholm, riots in usually calm suburb of Osby. Riots rocked Stockholm's suburb of Osby following the shooting of a machete-wielding pensioner. Around 50 youths in the heavily immigrant suburb rioted over the weekend. The youths pelted police with rocks and set fire to cars and buildings. The demonstrations are organised by Megafonon, a local youth organisation, to demonstrate their lack of faith in the police statements following the shooting of a 69-year-old machete-wielding pensioner earlier in the week quickly turned sour. "I understand that people react like this," said Rami Al-Khamizi from the organisation Megafonon. Ali Musalev, it is true that it burnt cars after what happened on Monday when a 69-year-old man was shot dead by the police. This was to ask the police to account. I have seen the brutal assault by the police. They have sent dogs to people who do not have any of this to do. They have different ways stormed and attacked groups of people. This presenter apologises for the lack of English grammar here, but they would have got much worse from non-European police. They should count themselves lucky it wasn't me in charge. World news. Don't you just love the Texans? Robbers rushed into a home in the Sharpstown area of Houston, Texas and bundled the homeowner into a closet. What the robbers didn't realise was that the closet contained the homeowner's gun safe. After calling 911 and believing the 3 robbers gone, the homeowner left the closet with the gun in hand. Walking downstairs, the homeowner surprised one of the robbers and shots were exchanged. The homeowner was unharmed, but the wounded robber stumbled outside and collapsed onto the sidewalk. The wounded suspect was hospitalised and the homeowner faces no charges for defending his property. World Value Survey shows world's most racist countries. The Global Social Attitudes Study claims that the most racially intolerant populations are all in the developing world, with Bangladesh, Jordan and India in the top 5. By contrast, the study of 80 countries over 3 decades found Western countries were most accepting of other cultures, with Britain, the US, Canada and Australia more tolerant than anywhere else. The data came from the World Value Survey, which measured the social attitudes of people in different countries, as reported by the Washington Post. The survey asked individuals what types of people they would refuse to live next to, and counted how many chose the option people of a different race, as a percentage for each country. Researchers have suggested that societies where more people don't want neighbours from other races can be considered less racially tolerant. The country with the highest proportion of intolerant people who wanted neighbours similar to them was Hong Kong, where 71.8% of the population would refuse to live next to someone of a different race. Next were Bangladesh on 71.7%, Jordan on 51.4% and India with 43.5%. World at 8 says, I think the World Value Survey is a load of codswallop. It would be interesting to know who they surveyed. Japan and Pakistan both made the top 10% of the most racially tolerant countries when they are anything but. What is interesting is the most intolerant operate a non-immigration policy anyway, and the most tolerant, which don't, suggests to me that it is an open-door policy which is being pushed here. Massive immigration makes a population overtly accept it, but it breeds a much less publicised intolerance. Saudi cleric prohibit women from using air conditioning. A man who claimed to be a Salafist Wahhabist cleric put the word out on Twitter that women should not flip on air conditioners at home because it sends the signal they're home and that could lead to moral depravities. The cleric said turning on the cooler ventilator is prohibited for women in the absence of their husbands because the woman's act is very dangerous and may bring about immorality in the society. When she turns the cooler on, someone may notice her presence home and this might bring about immorality, International Business Times reported. Words fail me on that one. Thought for the day. Are we shooting ourselves in the foot yet again? Before I read my thought today, I'm referring to Crankcase 8 and his comment on last Friday's thought, which contains some of the sayings of Winnie Churchill on the Jewish people. First, the comment that Lenin was not Jewish, made by Churchill, is partially right. Lenin's father Ilya married a Maria Blank. Maria was the daughter of a Russian Jewish physician, Alexander Dmitriev Blank, and his German-Swedish wife, Anna Ivanova Groschow. This means Lenin had a half-Jewish grandfather, which made Lenin less than a quarter by blood, and his mother non-Jewish, as it was her father, not her mother, who had Jewish blood. Lenin's father followed the Russian Orthodox Church and his mother was raised a Lutheran. Winnie stated correctly Lenin was not of the Jewish faith, and those remarks were made to a UK Parliament on the 5th of November 1919, well before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the death of Churchill in 1965. Also, please refer to Wikipedia for other facts on Lenin. Now to get on with the fact that we are shooting ourselves in the foot again with regard to the usual British attitude over new and old immigration. I had an email from one of our own who has just had an operation down south in a fairly local hospital. He's recovering but made a comment over the fact that most, if not all, the nursing staff were Filipino and asked what we would do without them. Well, my friend, we might start employing our own trained nurses and paying them adequately for a start. But although I have heard very good reports of foreign doctors in our hospitals, I have also heard very bad ones as well, especially over the patient-doctor communication angle, which is very important in the case of an individual's medical history or condition. I'm not going into detail on the NHS especially in this thought, but I am reminded of the story of my youngest son who'd fallen badly when around 13 years old. His elbow was banged and in a preliminary X-ray, NHS, showed nothing. For a couple of years he had increasingly less use of that arm and finally couldn't use it at all. I was a single parent at that time and relied solely on the NHS, and finally got an appointment with a specialist at a Reading hospital. And we're talking around the late 1980s here. We waited for hours and then saw a very nice Indian guy who spoke very little English, and he said, with the translation of an English nurse, that my son should sit in front of the television and waggle his arm around as a form of exercise. No further X-ray was offered or anything else. Result, arm still not usable because he was unable to move it or bend it at all to exercise it. Luckily, a few months later I acquired, through my job, Bupa and fled to the nearest Bupa clinic with my crippled son. After a series of X-rays and scans, he was put into the Bupa hospital and operated on, and what they found was that when he'd fallen all those years ago, a piece of bone had dislodged and had grown, blocking off all movement within that joint. So when he said he couldn't move it, he really couldn't move it. He returned home with a large piece of his elbow in a bottle, But what would have happened had I not been lucky enough to get private medical care for my family? Like thousands of us now, I rely on the NHS and believe that it is a miracle that this service has survived for so long with so many users and so little staff and money. It is homage to the system and to us Brits, I strongly believe. To see on the TV the flurries of NHS news on the collapse of A&E departments, and to see them blaming, as usual, the increase of our elderly being the main cause of the problems is absolutely ridiculous in the extreme. Of course our elderly have to make use of the NHS systems. Few now have the means, thanks to successive governments making them pay for immigration and foreign aid and stripping their pensions, so that accident and emergency may be the only recourse open to them. But to be fair, they've paid for the NHS most, if not all, of their lives, so they are entitled to NHS care 100% in the nationalist books, if not the socialist lovies that abound in our once great country and the establishment. How can the media, in all fairness, always hone in on the white elderly using up the system when, for well over 40 years, we've had a massive immigration of all ethnicities into this country who fly to the National Health Service every titch and turn? What happens to their tribal or family members now they're elderly? Do they go home to make use of their own health care or just to die? No, they troop in en masse to the local NHS hospital near their communities, don't they? Go into any NHS centre and you'll find not only the staff are mainly ethnic, but a goodly proportion of the patients are as well. And I'm including maternity as well as the elderly facilities in this. They're all part of the same system that was brought into being not for the world, but for the indigenous Brits after the Second World War, by Labour of all people, who Mandelson recently admits sent out search parties to get them to come to the UK. Talk about out the mouths of babes and all that. So socialists, commies, liberals, anti-racists, unite against sanity groups, bloody Chakrabarti and her kith and kin, note Labour have done more against this country than ever the Conservatives and Thatcher did, and they are in a fashion still carrying on under the guise of diversity and multiculturalism, and still promoting our white elderly as being beyond the pale and draining our resources. The short answer is they are entitled to drain our resources as they have paid for our resources, and the people who are not entitled to NHS resources are people who have never paid into the system. Right is right and wrong is wrong, regardless of the race card. I don't care if you're whiter than white or black as sin, don't take out if you haven't given in. In fact, the mantra that migrants are filling our labour gaps is another lie, like the figures for the white middle-aged unemployed who have never hit the job seekers' books because they're put on OAP benefits, which doesn't count apparently. Now, I haven't been up to London for nearly 4 years, but according to an interesting comment on our news, one lady has, and she didn't hear any English on the train going up or down to our capital city. There were no white English staff in the post office up there, and the same in Selfridges, which used to be a haven of Britishness. My poor London. Even I am desperately looking at TV programmes and films which date back to the 60s or even 70s, when it was spot the black face instead of spot the silly white bugger who's paying for us to be over here brigade. In fact, over 600,000 white residents have left London from 2001 to 2011. This is equivalent to a city the size of Glasgow technically emigrating from their own homes. And the one thing which really gets my goat is that when the TV companies do a film or play covering the 40s, they always manage to get in an Asian half-caste or a black person hanging loosely about the cast and a Nazi doing the dirty deeds. I thought we'd passed that stage in history, but apparently everything going out to the general public must pass muster, as including peoples from other ethnicities, even though they have bugger all to do with the storyline brigade. Says a lot for Big Brother attitude of socialism propaganda, doesn't it? Show it often enough and only the nationalists and racists will notice the difference. But to lose your capital city to a mishmash of ethnics isn't funny or desirable in anyone's culture, and it's stupid and short-sighted to view it as an improvement to any country, and indeed few other countries except maybe Belgium have lost their larger cities to ethnic majorities. It isn't racist to want to live in your own country, which incidentally for our children and grandchildren was not founded on the principle of bringing all the dross of the world in to repopulate it. Teachers, please note. surrounded for the most part by your own people. God knows there are enough indigenous Brits who make me want a bath, let alone bringing in other idiots who can't speak the language, don't want to integrate, are basically economic migrants, dress in a peculiar fashion and eat crap, who set up businesses selling crap and generally behave in an un-British fashion, and who I don't want to have to see on a normal day. 30 years ago we had a full staffing of our hospitals, the then mental homes, staffing of our care homes and retirement homes. Shops were staffed during the weekdays by full-time staff and teenagers got work at weekends. Our full complement of pubs were staffed, cinemas were staffed, and many of our now defunct industries and businesses were staffed. Jobs were for life, there was a form of fairness or unfairness, but it applied to us. We were a fully functioning country, far from perfect, but functioning, until diversity and the Frankfurt and Bilderberg lock went into advertising and media. That was the demise of Great Britain and the rise of the UK for Ethics for Ethnics Brigade. As soon as someone stepped onto our soil, they gained all the rights that it took our own to build up for years, including the NHS system. We took on and encouraged foreign peoples into this country and our culture, and they're now paying us back for doing so by increasing this traffic to an alarming degree. Now they're not doing anything bad, are they? What is the mantra? Don't blame the immigrants, blame the governments. No, the mantra should be blame the people. They put up and shut up, so they get what they deserve, is my mantra. We nationalists have been telling the truth for years. Unpalatable though it may be, the UK is too full. As for the Scots who would rather have Johnny Foreigner than us Brits, fine. Send all the immigrants up there and rebuild Hadrian's Wall, withdraw financial aid and businesses, send all Scots back home as well, and that's okay with me. I would never deny a man the love of his own country. As we are not denied the love of our own country, well, as long as we share it with all and sundry, that is. We have to face it, that many of our own people cash in on the immigration scam as well. Cheap, efficient Polish cleaners, workers for factories and farms, all of which are used to be manned by seemingly lazy and unreliable British staff at one time. Although the workers in the Kent hop fields would argue that one, as all of the East End at one time got themselves off to Kent for a working holiday in the good old days. That is, if we even make our own beer down there now. It would appear that even our prostitutes are now Eastern European, courtesy of the Russian mafiosi over here, and the Chinese have always brought in their millions to every country that boasts a financial system. Most of our TV is ethnically biased staff-wise, and it must be odd for any foreigner visiting to see that he has actually just done a U-turn and ended up back in India, Arabia, Africa, the Middle East, China, Japan, Korea, Nepal, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaya, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Romania, and indeed wherever he might have hailed from. He'll be just as disappointed in the UK as we are probably, and will go back home to a non-immigration country, a very happy and wise man, knowing he's sent his idiots over here. In fact, many of our British state schools have no white pupils at all, which says a lot for a country that used to have the best education systems in the world. It also says a lot that many of our first-generation Asian, Chinese and West Indian immigrants send their kids back home to be educated, because although our country is good enough to fund them and their families, our education systems are not. To beg a belief even further on our lack of sense towards immigration nationally, there are legal firms opening up in the UK for the oncoming rush of Romanians to help them submit compensation applications when not speaking the language of the country that they're suing. Mind you, Sherry Blairwitch has been cashing in on that one for decades. Also, with 38 Bulgarians and Romanians starting work here every day, and that is the published figure, do you wonder why, if you're white, male, over 50, you'll actually never get a job again in your country? Now you know, but what will anyone actually do about it? Still think it's racist or far right or generally untenable to care about what happens in your own country, as opposed to just becoming part of the White Flight Brigade? Is it wicked to actually not give a damn about immigrants who come here or what happens to them? Is it politically beyond the pale to want your own land to reflect your own culture, colours and creeds rather than a melting pot of Islamic green? Why is it so bad to care? Our governments don't care, our establishment don't care, and worst of all, our own children and grandchildren don't care. They just accept, which is the meaning of the word Islam. Is there a connection there? I sincerely hope not. For all our sakes, I really do. And finally, this really bugs me. The United Nations, which is always thinking of helpful ways to make our lives horribly worse, has a new proposal. You've probably heard it already. In a new push, a report from the UN's Food and Agricultural Organisation says Western societies should get over their disgust at the idea of eating bugs and join in. Wasps, bees, beetles, ants, grasshoppers and yes, crickets are protein rich, abundant and have a small environmental footprint compared to the other animal food sources, says the report, titled Edible Insects, Future Prospects for Food and Feed Security. Eating bugs could even help fight obesity, the UN says, in the hopes of getting Michelle Obama on board. More than 1,900 species of insects are eaten around the world, mainly in Africa and Asia, but people in the West generally turn their noses up at the likes of grasshoppers, termites and other crunchy fare. The authors of the study by the Forestry Department, part of the UN Food and Agriculture Organisation, said many insects contain the same amount of protein and minerals as meat, and more healthy fats doctors recommended in balanced diets. The truth of the matter is that many people in Africa and Asia eat bugs. They also face starvation and severe malnutrition. They're not out to fight obesity. The poor devils are trying not to die. We have a diversity-riddled comment from a scientist, Arnold van Huys, from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, one of the authors of the report. In the West we have a cultural bias and think that because insects come from developing countries, they cannot be good, said the scientist. Clearly, if you don't eat bugs, you're a racist. And when the Food and Agricultural Organisation isn't telling people to eat bugs, it's committed to the noble mission of fighting to stop the pursuit of Judaism in Palestine. So are the UN bigwigs, excuse the phrase, eating bugs? Oddly enough, bugs don't appear on the menu for the United Nations delegates' dining room. Despite their incredible nutritious value and obesity-fighting powers, there are no ants, grasshoppers or bugs of any kind available to the humanitarian defenders of a better world. There is, however, sugarcane glazed Chilean sea bass, skillet seared Atlantic salmon, New Zealand rack of lamb, roasted loin of lamb, crispy red snapper with langoustine and medallion of filet mignon. Meanwhile, at the 2002 United Nations Food and Agriculture Organisation Summit on Food Security, delegates ate bugs. And by bugs I mean they ate goose, lobster and foie gras. Also on the menu was salmon with peppers and polenta, lobster in vinaigrette and fillet of goose with olives. The opening day of the World Food Summit, dedicated to combating global hunger, was marked yesterday by a sumptuous lunch for the 3,000 delegates served by 170 Italian waiters. The summit leaders were offered foie gras, lobster and goose stuffed with olives, followed by fruit compote. Then delegates committed themselves to halving the number of hungry people in the world to 400 million by 2015. In the event, only 25 million have come off the list and much of southern Africa is now being engulfed by famine. The FAO now claims the number of hungry people in the world is at 870 million, and their solution is to tell Americans and Europeans to eat bugs. This presenter says, I'm salivating already down here, and it isn't the thought of a few grasshoppers getting me going either. The downside from this new initiative is that many of the bugs mentioned contribute to the flora, fauna and continuance of the circle of nature in their countries, and bees contribute all over the world. So apart from paving the way to a world overrun by the starving millions and then promoting Soylent Green for all peoples over the age of 50, I fail to see what these idiots at the UN are actually paid for. Perhaps they should promote birth pills and condoms instead. You've been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynne Mozar and I wish you all a very good night. Pakistani origin were brothers Adel and Mubarak Ali from Regent Street in Wellington. Peter Hennigan, publicity manager for Channel 4, said 3 years ago Telford police allowed cameras to start filming what was to become one of the biggest child sex abuse cases in the UK. Mr Hennigan said that the programme examined how Telford police also had to face the reality that the men who were perpetrators in this case were all British Pakistanis. World at 8 asks, were they all Pakistani or not? The Shropshire Star says almost all and Channel 4 says all. Well, it bears out profam in that it is a Muslim family affair and goes back generations. Have you heard that, Avsal? Machete murderer who admits killing up to 400 people can't be booted out of UK. A murderer who admits killing up to 400 people, many in bloody machete attacks, is living in the UK after being granted asylum. John Tuo has been living in a taxpayer-funded home since sneaking in illegally from Africa in 2003 and receives £160 a month pocket money from the National Asylum Support Service. For 7 years he worked for the Mungiki in Kenya, a criminal mob behind some of the continent's worst atrocities. Tuo, 27, admitted an immigration tribunal to killing about 100 to 400 people. He even said he'd taken part in the sickening practice of police officers in bringing them to justice without being accused of racism is to be exposed in a hard-hitting TV documentary. Channel 4 will be showing The Hunt for Britain's Sex Gangs at 9 p.m. on Thursday the 23rd of May 2013. The hour-long Dispatches special featuring interviews with many of Operation Chalice's leading detectives will tell the story of one of Britain's largest ever child sex abuse investigations into a sex ring. The investigations were part of Operation Chalice, which uncovered over 100 victims and 200 or so suspects. After several trials over almost 2 years, 7 men have been sentenced for their role in these crimes. The leading players in the network of abusers, almost all are
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynne Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Monday the 20th of May. Were they or weren't they? Channel 4 Dispatches on Shropshire sex ring. Machete murderer who admits killing up to 400 people can't be booted out of the UK. Kent Police 9, Border Agency 5. Marine Le Pen injured spine in fall. Germany calls for 2-year ban on jihadists returning from Syria. Stockholm, riots in usually calm suburb of Husby. Don't you just love Texans? World Value Survey shows world's most racist countries. Saudi cleric prohibit women from using air conditioning. Thought for the day, are we shooting ourselves in the foot yet again? And finally, this really bugs me. UK news. Were they or weren't they? Channel 4 Dispatches on Shropshire sex ring. The Shropshire Star tells us the horrific abuse and sexual exploitation of schoolgirls by a group of Asian men in Shropshire and the problems facing